Welcome to FRE Lunch, the official podcast of the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida. I'm Elena Poulin, the Marketing and Communications Specialist for the department.
And I'm Caleb Stair, Assistant Instructional Professor of Food and Resource Economics and the Coordinator for Undergraduate Research in the department, meaning I get to interact regularly with the members of our UF community and see all the cool and interesting topics being explored.
That's why we made this podcast, to showcase the many ways students and faculty are using research to understand and address the complex issues facing agricultural and natural resource industries.
In 2025, there's lots of interesting issues that economics can be applied to, but that's only one faucet of the whole solution.
To get the complete picture on one of these issues, we're teaming up with the UF Water Institute and new co-host Sarah Mark for a deep dive into the fathoms of Florida's fresh water.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mark, the Communications and Events Specialist for the Water Institute. Essentially, we serve as a connector between collaborators across the university and beyond.
From harmful algal blooms to hydrilla. That's right, today's episode is all about things harming Florida's waters.
And while that might seem pretty broad, a lot of the things we're talking about have already been discussed this season. Things like stakeholder perceptions and ecological functions.
While harmful algae blooms, also known as HABs, and invasive species are pretty different, they do have some similarities.
That's right. Both have a natural component as well as a human-influenced component and are long-standing matters in the state that you may have heard on the news.
Both are also mostly related to there being too much of something, not a good thing.
Wait, isn't the saying the more the merrier?
Yeah, aren't more plants, for example, a good thing?
Not exactly. And to further help us and our audience understand, we're joined today by a team of experts.
Our first guest is Dr. Lisa Krimsky.
Thanks for inviting us to talk on the podcast. My interest in water issues, I guess, started back in my undergraduate career. I was fortunate enough to be able to do a study abroad program in Denmark, and it was a marine biology program. And so that sort of started my trajectory towards the marine and coastal issues, which is where I primarily work now, marine and coastal water quality and harmful algal blooms.
Graduate students at UF are also involved in this area, and today we are joined by two of them. First is Liam Corcoran.
Hi, everyone. I'm a first-year PhD student in the FRE. My area of focus is in environmental and resource economics with a specific focus on invasive species management and water resource policy. I recently completed my master's thesis that looked at Florida anglers' preferences for managing hydrilla, which is a highly invasive aquatic plant. What got me interested in water issues was really seeing how central water is both to ecosystems and local communities across the country. And then I guess I got interested in water policy in my first year of undergraduate. I took a class that focused on water policy issues and read a book called The Water Will Come by Jeff Godell. And that book kind of opened my eyes to how pertinent it is to focus on these issues.
And finally, we are joined by Abhishek Rajan.
I am Abhishek, and I'm a PhD student at Food and Resource Economics Department. My interest in water sparked from an internship in flood-affected regions of Eastern India during my master's program. The internship allowed me to interact with flood-affected households, and it exposed me to the challenges due to extreme weather events. And this kind of further pushed me to do research on the complex interlinkages of water and livelihoods. My doctoral research at present at UF primarily focuses on how water is used, valued, and governed.
Now, for sure, these topics are pretty big and could probably be a whole episode on their own, but let's start with invasive species.
Well, here in Florida, we tend to think about our more mobile invasive species. Looking at you, feral hogs, today is all about a different kind.
In Florida especially, we're vulnerable to invasive species because of the warm climate, the diverse ecosystems in the state, and then also the high level of trade and tourism. So there's a lot of invasive species that are currently present in Florida. Some that I can think of off the top of my head are like the Burmese python in the Everglades, the lionfish in the coastal waters, and then also one of the biggest probably plants is hydrilla, which is throughout the state.
You might be wondering, how much damage could a plant do? Well, it turns out quite a bit.
So if we speak about the state of Florida, so one of the studies estimates that Florida spends around $20 million in a year to control and manage aquatic invasive plants in its public waters. And of this $20 million, around half of them, around $10 million is spent alone on controlling hydrilla, because hydrilla is considered as the most aggressive aquatic invaders in the waters of Florida. And if we talk like for the entire US, for controlling for like the losses due to aquatic invasive species plant, it is around $14 billion is the estimated economic losses due to aquatic invasive species presence. And around $600 million is spent annually to control aquatic invasive species in the waters of United States.
While $600 million is a whole lot, what is that money being spent on?
There are other types of management, but it isn't really prevalent in Florida. One which we looked at was mechanical harvesting, which is essentially removing the invasive plant, and in this case, hydrilla, directly from the water using like a machine. But for the most part in Florida, they primarily use aquatic herbicides to control aquatic invasive plants.
And with these high costs and different strategies, there are conflicting perspectives on what is the best choice.
Invasive species management has not been easy in Florida, and it has also led to like a lot of public debate that what should be the right method or what should be the right management technique to control invasive species. And that's why there is an importance of engaging more stakeholders into the resource management, or how we need to manage aquatic invasive species, also our water resources.
For example, my thesis kind of focused on anglers and recreational anglers and their use of public waterways for fishing. And we've found that, their perception might be that they actually might prefer some hydrilla cover because it can provide, a habitat for sports fish. Because of the way that hydrilla outcompetes natural plants that were there before, they kind of replace these plants as habitats. So for them, removing hydrilla altogether might not be in their best interest. And so it might actually be, managing at a level that still supports good fishing, without making access impossible, which is, again, very different from like a waterfront homeowner or a boater who might just want hydrilla removed completely because it interferes, with navigation, aesthetics.
It's important for researchers like Abhishek and Liam to study public perception because that affects policy adoption.
And also it is said that the herbicides, they are approved by federal agencies, and because it says that they are safe to use even after the treatment of hydrilla using those chemical controls, but there is a growing perception about putting chemical into the water. And this has kind of fueled a lot of debate among the stakeholders, and because they are more concerned about the environmental impacts of using chemical into the water. And however, the mechanical harvesting, which is more favored right now by some sections or by some stakeholders, but it is quite expensive. It is almost like 3 or 4 times more expensive than using a herbicide. Also, it is not that much effective.
And although the issue itself is different, we see very similar themes emerging with harmful algal bloom management, that different individuals have different preferences and perspectives and values that are going to inform what their preference is for the management strategy. We did a survey back in 2019 evaluating Floridians' preferences for harmful algal bloom management. And overwhelmingly, Floridians wanted to see that prevention strategy. So that's that long-term addressing the nutrient issue, even though that was no indication that it would actually clear up a harmful algal bloom. And it's a long-term strategy. We're talking 10 plus years, but that's really what their preference was. The management in terms of a control strategy was limited. And I think that's just a lack of understanding of what the management options are.
Like Lisa said, HABs are a bit different, but both invasive species and HABs are ecosystem disruptors. Algae, which already exists in the water, can also be challenging.
So harmful algal blooms are, as the name implies, they're from algal species or algae, which are photosynthetic plant and plant-like organisms. And an algal bloom is essentially the substantial increase in algal biomass in an aquatic system. So that can be freshwater, brackish, like in our estuaries, or marine waters out in the ocean. And they are not necessarily invasive, meaning that these algae can be, are normally found in background levels in the system. But when they bloom, they almost function like an invasive species in that they cause the same or similar ecosystem disruptions as an invasive species does, outcompeting the traditionally common and prevalent phytoplankton that are in that aquatic system.
So, what kinds of organisms are there that exist in Florida's water?
The organism that causes the harmful algal bloom is going to be different depending on different types of, the water body that you're in. In fresh waters, they're most commonly caused by cyanobacteria, or what's more commonly referred to as blue-green algae. And in marine or salt waters, more likely than not, they're going to be caused by either like an algae that's called a dinoflagellate or a diatom.
Usually, these blooms are caused by excessive nutrients in the water as well as some other factors.
Like, is the water moving or stagnant, what the temperature is, things like that. But once you figure out why it can happen, what do you do about it?
We can talk about long-term strategies that address the nutrient inputs, and those are traditionally referred to as preventative strategies. You can have mitigation strategies that during a bloom, it limits the impact, whether it's societal, environmental, or economic impact that those blooms are causing. And then you can have, to some extent, limited control strategies. And that's similar to what Liam and Abhishek were talking about with invasive species, where you have that bloom and you're actually trying to eliminate it. But that is very restricted by, again, geography, scale, type of aquatic system that there is.
So, is there any connection between harmful algal blooms and invasive species?
There isn't necessarily a direct link between invasive species and harmful algal blooms, but oftentimes there can be indirect links. So, for example, if you have invasive aquatic plants, they can form monocultures, smothering out the native plant systems. That smothering, the decay of that plant material can cause low oxygen on the bottom of the water body. And that low oxygen can actually trigger the release of phosphorus from sediments. Phosphorus is a nutrient, and those excess nutrients can fuel harmful algal blooms. When we're talking about animal invasive species in aquatic systems, many of them, especially the smaller zooplankton, they actually feed on algae. And many harmful algal species actually have competitive advantages where they just don't taste good, or they have a mucus or spines. And so the invasive species will preferentially graze on the beneficial plant and algae species, leaving space for the harmful algae to grow. And lastly, the management of invasive species can actually cause indirect links to harmful algae, whether it's mechanical harvesting or the spraying of herbicides that kills the aquatic invasive plant material. When that plant material dies, it releases nutrients into the aquatic water body, especially lakes and ponds. And that decay, again, that nutrients can fuel harmful algal blooms.
Before we go, are there any key takeaways you'd like our audience to have?
We talked about the costs of managing invasive species and harmful algal blooms, but there's also costs of not managing them. And some of those are, the environmental costs, which we've talked about a little bit, but there's definitely economic costs in terms of the lack of tourism opportunities. There's been linkages between harmful algal blooms and decreases in property values. The time spent of having to shift people's jobs away from what they would normally be doing to actually doing the harmful algal bloom and invasive species management. When there's fish kills associated with the harmful algal bloom, the manpower and the resources to do that cleanup is pretty substantial. And then, of course, for harmful algal blooms, although not all of them are toxin producing, some are. And so then you have the human health risks and costs associated with that as well.
So one of the takeaways which I can talk about, which comes from one of our research, is that effective communication is needed when it comes to shaping the public preferences. Because right now we see that there is like a bigger section of, there are like different stakeholders which are concerned about the use of herbicides. Although we find out in our research that people do not have enough information about mechanical harvesting, or they do not have complete comparative information about the pros and cons of both the methods. So, and we find out that on providing, using an economic experiment, we found out that on providing right information to the public, it can shape their preferences and it can reduce the need to switch to more expensive mechanical approach, which is right now being asked by like different stakeholders. So providing information on economic and environmental consequences of different management options can lead to like greater acceptance of the current or like any management strategy which is being used by the state agencies to control invasive species.
Yeah, I guess to build off of what Abhishek and Lisa said, I would say, the HABs and invasive species aren't just environmental issues. They're also economic, social, and public health issues. I mean, they affect everything from fishing and tourism to drinking water and property values. And managing them isn't as simple as just, spraying herbicide or throwing money at a problem. It's a complex challenge. It requires balancing trade-offs, between short-term control and then long-term sustainability, between cost and ecological impact, and then between different stakeholder priorities. So I guess there's one thing I would want people to walk away with. It's that these issues aren't just about the science, but they're also about the people, about their values and the way we choose to live with and manage our natural resources. So definitely, even though we'd want to find the most effective strategy, taking into account people's perceptions and voices is very important when developing these management strategies.
So, to wrap up, these are complex issues, and there might not be one right answer.
What works for you might not work best for the person down the street.
Or in another county.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss potential solutions.
Our hope is that by exploring some parts of the solutions, we are better able to see the best path forward.
One that benefits both us and our environment.
If you're interested in learning more about any of the work our guests have done, we'll link to it in this episode's description.
If you've made it this far, you've finished the entire episode, and we thank you for that. Tune in next time for more food for thought. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of FRE Lunch. We hope you'll come back again for seconds.